Okay, welcome everybody. It is the top of the hour here. We're just taking a second to get started and let everybody into the Zoom room and on YouTube. Okay, looks like we have a great crowd here. Thanks for joining me live, those of you that are in the Zoom room with me here, and thanks for registering and taking that time here to join me on this discussion today. I'm Derek Oger, the Executive Director with Conservatory Canada, and welcome to our Friday webinar. I'm running this one solo today, which is kind of fun. It's always nice to just join in with you, and you can have my stream of consciousness for the next hour or so if it goes that long. I don't think it'll go any longer than that. A couple of things before we start. Today, we're going to talk about strategies for working with neurodiverse students. I'll talk about what that means, what some of the diagnoses are that may play into that, how I got into that, and then into some strategies. And I hope we can generate some kind of discussion or back and forth through the chat box. I would love all of your thoughts as well. And if anyone has any questions at any time, feel free to use the raise your hand feature. It would be great if more of you would do that. I can bring you on live and we can have, bring you right into the discussion. That would be a great thing today. Next Friday, well, first of all, let's talk about last Friday. Deborah Wanless was here and gave us an incredible masterclass on teaching beginners using her method. Let's begin. I would encourage anyone that's interested to go back to the YouTube channel and take a look at that and have a look at it, because we're going to have part 2 next Friday, April 28th. She's going to elaborate on everything she took us through then. And, maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and just take you into the website for a second. Just a quick refresher for those that aren't sure. Here's our website here. Sorry, I'm just going to check that. Okay. Digital badges. I just wanted to talk about digital badges for a second on the homepage. Digital badges are a great way, and I'll talk about them a little bit later today as they relate probably to the discussion here that we're going to have. Really great for neurodiverse students in that they don't have to sit a whole exam. They don't have to prepare 4 or 5 pieces, all of the technique and skills all at once. This is a lighter way for students to get involved in the assessment process and give them a performance goal to work toward while you embrace this idea of recording music, something we all kind of got used to over the pandemic. Record 3 pieces, submit it for assessment. We can give you really detailed feedback because we can watch the recording multiple times. We get it right. We give the student a gold, silver, or bronze standing. Some feedback that I think is even better quality than a music festival adjudication. Adjudication's great, at a music festival live. I do a fair bit of that myself from time to time, but we're so pressed for time. It's hard to really get it right 100% of the time. We miss things. This digital badge format, unlike the exam even, we can really get the detail right for the students. The feedback is really meaningful. And if they want to raise their standing from whatever they have, they can resubmit for half the fee, and we can watch the improvement and chart the improvement for the student. So this is something that's just gaining traction now. I know a lot of you have probably watched the webinars we've done in the past on digital badges, but I encourage you to go and have a look at that. If you're all curious about what to do with those other students that aren't doing exams. I know every time I poll teachers such as yourselves, it's somewhere between 1 and 10% of your students do exams. Well, what do we do with the other 90%? There's a lot of recreational things, and some of those things I'll talk about today. But I think there's a place for these digital badges. And so I just bring that up. You can go from here on our website. This is the homepage. You can go to the digital badge page where you can actually download the syllabus and have a look at the whole thing. And then maybe even take in one of the webinars that we've done previously on it. Syllabus is quite simple. It gives you a ton of flexibility in terms of what kind of repertoire students play, and tells you how you can use our other syllabi to find the music for that. Also on the homepage, for those that aren't sure how to get to the YouTube channel, just below that, visit CCTV on YouTube. We get to our homepage here for the YouTube channel. YouTube channels are a little hard to follow, I realize. And so I've got this sort of laid out in a way where you can find the latest videos right at the top. If I look at the live tab here that I'm on, if I go to the home tab on the YouTube channel, it's a little bit harder to follow, but you can see past live streams partway down. This will give you all the live streams in order if you're trying to look for a particular webinar. The one I encourage you to look at here is Deborah Wanless Let's Begin method, streamed last Friday. You can also go to playlists here in the top middle. And in the playlist, you'll find Teaching Beginner Piano. That's where you'll find things like Marjorie's couple of webinars we did with her, as well as Deborah Wanless. Today's webinar will probably fit into there a little bit as well. I'm not sure it'll fit into one of these, but you can always take a look at the webinar replays playlist, and that as well should give you most of these all in order if they would pop up. Yeah, and you can see them on the right-hand side there. So that's a little bit about the YouTube channel, how that works, how our homepage is currently working. What's coming up next Friday is Deborah Wanless Part 2. Friday, May 5th, I didn't have any scheduled in there. And so I just decided this week that it's usually around this time of year that I'll do an Ask Me Anything kind of webinar. There's been a number of questions about theory lately, and I noticed one in the chat box already here. So I'm thinking that we'll have a big Ask Me Anything on Friday, May 5th. It'll to do a lot with theory. I'll put a few things together to give to you that we're noticing on some of the theory papers, how we're doing things. I can talk a little bit about the in-person exams coming up in June. Exam portals and how our examiners are now assessing things. I can just fill you in blanks on a lot of things that have been going on in the background over the past few months and give you a couple of hints about some things that we're planning for our future. But mostly take your questions. Anything, we have the big June exam session coming up where a lot of students have registered for in-person exams, and some of you may have questions about that. Some of you may have questions about registering for flex exams, how to do these flex exams. Can we have flex exams in person? The answer is yes, depending on where you live, unfortunately, but that is a possibility. How online exams are working, how can we improve online exams, some of the protocols around that. Any of those kind of questions I'll answer for you in 2 weeks on Friday, May 5th. If you can't wait, of course, just email me anytime and we can talk about that. Friday, May 12th, we're going to have Eleanor Gummer here from One Eye Publications, and she's going to go through her Piano Kids method book for us. So very similar to what Deborah Wanless is currently doing for us in 2 parts. Eleanor is going to do that on the 12th. And then at the end of May on the 26th, Eleanor and Cecile are going to be back to talk more about women composers and the latest music they are publishing and finding. So that's kind of how things play out over the next little bit. A couple of questions. Sandra's asking, what is the name of the theory text that was in the webinar last year? It was in the process of being reprinted. Okay, so just to clarify that, we haven't reprinted any of our former texts. They still exist. They're called Theory for Students by Dr. Cook and Stephen Fielder, Theory 1 to 4. Those are still as is. And so they haven't been reprinted or anything like that. But the new theory that we were advocating for or, using as a recommended text is Deborah Wanless's Total Theory. And those webinars, I believe, are still all on the YouTube channel. You can check those out. They're a really great update on our texts. They're a little bit cheaper. There are no errors in there. I know some of our old legacy textbooks for theory have a lot of errors and things that people sometimes get disgruntled about. But Deborah Wanless's Total Theory it's not geared directly toward Conservatory Canada, but it gets through all the information quite coherently, and it goes hand in hand with our syllabus. And she's created these supplements that are free to download from our website. And, maybe I'll go back to our website here just to show everyone where that is. Under the Learning tab, Theory and History. And a little bit down here, you can see all these downloads where you can download the theory syllabus for 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. And on the left side, you can see Total Theory Supplement 1. So if you're doing Theory 1 and you're using the Total Theory text, in order to get all of the information you need for Conservatory Canada, here's a dedicated supplement that fleshes out all sorts of extra material for you. There's almost 100 pages here. It's free. You can download it. It gives you charts to tell you where all the information is. And then extra exercises, extra material, all sorts of really great things you can see here. So that's how Total Theory works for theories 1 to 4. And then the Theory 5 text now that we're using is also a Total Theory text that Deb authored herself a year ago. And it's called Harmony for Beginners, I believe. And it goes really well with Theory 5. So that's something I would encourage you to check out if you're not sure what to be using for that. Now, another question here. When will digital badges be available for voice? In a perfect world, I would have thought they would have been available by now. But things have just been kind of busy around here, and I wanted to work out a couple of bugs that we were having with the piano digital badges and get a little more uptake on that first. And then I hope to be working on that, though, in the summer so that digital badges for voice will be available first thing in the fall. It's actually not hard for us to do. We just have to do some consulting on it, working with certain teachers. If anyone's interested about theory or digital badges for voice, feel free to email me and we can start a discussion about that, because it's definitely something on my radar that I'd like to do. And I'm glad you've asked about it, because in my mind, I'm thinking that digital badges for voice is something that in the long run may even be more popular than piano. So it's something we're very interested in doing. Okay, so to the topic at hand, and let me just get a slideshow presentation up for you here so you can follow along my thoughts. And again, as I go along here, this is a tricky subject, and I'll just give you a bit of background. A number of years ago, I'd worked up something about left brain and right brain kids. It was a workshop. I think I eventually called it Unlock the Keys to Teaching Right Brain Children. And this is something that, it was about 10, 15 years ago. I did it in a few different places back when we were holding in-person workshops before I held this job, actually. And it was pretty successful. I put a lot of time and effort into it at the time, and I haven't really revisited it since. And I've been meaning to do it for quite a while. I also have someone in mind to bring on here that would be a little bit more of an expert in this sort of field than I am. The only expertise I speak from is just simply noticing that large numbers of my students I would classify as neurodiverse. It's not necessarily that the parents are coming to me with a diagnosis and telling me this is the certain way. I just noticed that starting about 20 years ago, things had really changed with students. Around 1993, I'd say, is a real bellwether year, almost exactly 20 years ago. No, geez, that's 30 years now. Wow, time's flying. So about 30 years ago, I guess I noticed students were changing. And I had to adjust my methods as I was doing some teaching, right? Or quite a bit of teaching at the time, I think probably more than I'm doing now, that's for sure. And trying to figure out how to handle these things where students were just coming with different brains, more creative. Let's just say that it was just different than the norm. And it's hard to put your finger on what it is because, we're trying to normalize everything nowadays. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, I've done this workshop a few times. This is just a small snippet of it. I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about it, but something I wanted to present to you, get you to reflect ideas back to me and determine if this is an avenue we want to explore together in this venue a little bit further, because it's something that from a health and wellness point of view, I'm certainly more concerned about nowadays. When I think about my own student population here, I've got a small private studio. I also teach at the local university here in a small capacity. And I would say this past year, about half of my older university students were definitely fit in the neurodiverse category. And of my private students, I just tallied some numbers, and 1/4 exactly I would classify as neurodiverse. So it's a big part of what I do. It's been like that for quite a long time. And I suspect it's probably a big part of what you all do as well, and probably why you're here. So let's talk about, first of all, trends in studio music teaching. I used to start this way a lot with our webinars. We've noticed for a long time now, there's just less focus on teaching to the exam or the music festival. A lot of students just simply don't seem to fit into that for various reasons. Number one, because they're rather overscheduled and they don't have time to practice, or they practice in these short bursts of curiosity all the time, and it's not enough to sustain a full program or handle the rigors and stresses of playing in front of a live adjudicator in some sense, I think. We've gone through periods of online teaching lately, of course, for obvious reasons. And I know a lot of us are probably still doing that on some level in a hybrid model. We have to be flexible with our studio scheduling because students are overscheduled. We're constantly getting inundated with, rescheduling requests. I mean, we all probably handle that a little differently. And a lot of us, I think, probably just, end up not teaching certain students because they can't fit into our model of how we want to be teaching or need to be teaching to have some kind of decorum to our teaching schedule and teaching day or teaching week. It's just impossible to keep working overtime to do makeup lessons outside of our normal office hours. Students practice sporadically. I've mentioned that. A shift to contemporary repertoire in general, away from classical. And I noticed this about 13, 14 years ago, where all of a sudden in my student recitals, the majority of the pieces were contemporary in nature, whereas the year or two previous, it was a lot of sonatinas and minuets still. And then all of a sudden that just flipped. And I'm not sure if it was me or the students. I'd always taught contemporary music, but suddenly they were craving this in a different way, in a way that I had to make sort of almost mandatory as the sort of predominant teaching mode for them. But giving them the free choice over the last 30 years or more, over time, they're gravitating more toward contemporary styles. I say away from classical with a question mark, because I do notice that there are some students, I've always noticed this actually, and again, reminded lately that even though we're going in a contemporary direction, a lot of them ask for the classical back at some point. I have one student in particular I can think of. I'm trying to think of, solid examples without revealing any identities or anything, because these are being recorded, these webinars. But a student, grade 8 student at school, hasn't been practicing much the last couple of years, but prior to that showed quite a bit of promise for learning any kind of style of music and musical ability, and then just kind of fell off their radar, and we're just kind of been percolating, simmering, let's say, and then all of a sudden picks up Beethoven's Für Elise and just learns it in 3 weeks. and is open to learning the style. He's only, prior to that, we're learning grade 2 music because he wasn't practicing much. And so this piece is much harder, but he's quite interested in it. And then since has picked up, a piece that's even harder than that, classical music. And that's somewhat saving him. We often think of the contemporary music as saving a student who's not practicing so much. Sometimes I do notice the opposite happen, and I'm seeing that now in a bigger way since the pandemic, especially. I don't know what's behind that. It's just an observation. Online learning tools like through YouTube, students learning music through YouTube tutorials, and they come to us with this music learned by ear or by visual means. It's really interesting to watch that work, and other technology, whether it's apps, recording. We've all gotten into recording a little bit, I think, which is a really useful tool in teaching. And then RMM is something I experienced or worked with about 10 years ago, recreational music making. There's a huge movement in the US around this, where you get groups of students together, whether they're adults or youngsters, and have these jamming groups, basically, where you have a bunch of keyboards in a piano setting set up. Let's say they're piano students, have keyboards set up. You can use different sounds and create different music, whether it's classical, contemporary, in an ensemble setting. It's recreational, but social is sort of the main aspect. And I dove into this quite a bit and had 3 years where I had these recreational music making groups come every Saturday morning, different ages, and they were quite successful at the time. We can use new tools to teach improvisation now, and through the Conservatory of Canada, of course, we provide that through the American Popular Piano Series, backing tracks, all that kind of stuff is starting to come out, and people are getting well versed in it. And I use it quite a bit in my studio to do something a little bit off the beaten path when students are getting bored, let's say. Other trends, we're seeing students seeking more immediate success at a higher level. And what I mean by that is students that are, learning the basics, but there's this craving they have to actually, they see other people playing a certain way and they want to emulate that, and they get passionate about it, and they find pieces of music that are way beyond their level, and they just figure out how to do it. And I always resisted that for a long time. And about 15 years ago, I kind of gave into that to see what would happen. And, I've come to accept it, and I still see it all the time, where students are way in over the head, but this is how they want to learn. And so I've gone with it, and it's been quite successful. And I noticed that they can fill in the blanks rather quickly once they gain some confidence with it. Some of them, they're not successful at it. They go back to our regular program, and I just keep finding other ways to stimulate them until they're ready to make these sort of quantum or logarithmic leaps, I guess, exponential leaps in development. And then one of the other trends in studio music teaching, that's why what we're going to talk a lot about today, and as we see more neurodiverse students in our studios. Some characteristics of neurodiverse students, we'll spend a moment here just to define it so that we're all on the same page. And again, feel free to challenge me. I want this more to be a dialogue today rather than me just dictating how this is. It's certainly not my way. Learning styles and thought patterns are different than neurotypical norms. And this is where we have to be careful, because this is a cultural construct here. We have to exercise caution in defining this, because, what is a norm comes up then. And so something I sort of purposely did about 20 years ago, as I started to see more of these students, I just tried to teach them as normal. I mean, I'm sure I have ASD diagnosed kids in my studio, but no one's telling me they're diagnosed with any label, and I don't put a label on them. I just treat them in a certain way. And over time, I try to find a way that makes it feel normal, that this is a normal, safe place to come. And here, when I do these webinars, I am in my teaching studio, and maybe I'll show you later about a few of the things that I've set up. And so in terms of neurodiverse students, it may include a behavioral component that sets them apart from other things that we typically see. Some neurodiverse students, they may be incredibly uninhibited in public situations or in any social situation, I'd say, where some are quite inhibited. But I find for the most part, we're talking about students that are more uninhibited. Clinically, this includes students with ADHD, ADD, learning disabilities, and ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, and its related designations. All sorts of things out there. We call it Tourette's, we call it Asperger's. I know there's a movement to try and get this all under one umbrella, and it depends on the agency that's doing the measuring, or in different public health agencies, and how they decide to package this. So these students, they can be challenged by either socializing, use of language, whether it's input or output, sensory sensitivities. We'll talk about that a bit later. Their ability to process, executive function in the brain, behavioral issues, trouble adapting and transitioning between activities. And then some of their strengths can include the ability to really hyper-focus and be incredibly productive. conceptualize, and that is being able to think about many different concepts and how they are built together all at once, rather than thinking linear detail. They conceptualize, can see the whole picture and how all these interrelated parts work together. And they can have incredible attention to detail. And of course, most of all, I find them most curious because they're very good at music, a lot of them, if not all of them, most of them. Music's kind of a conceptual thing that brings a lot of things together, and they love using their whole brain. I talk about ASD a fair bit. I do a fair bit of research into this in another hat that I wear as a health and wellness coach. And I find myself constantly surrounded online when I'm doing courses and things by people that are involved in the autism movement and advocating for autism people. So the statistics I find interesting. And so today I'm not just talking about autistic students or students that are diagnosed with ASD, but also a whole host of these other things around it, ADHD, and so on that I've mentioned earlier. But what I do pay attention to is the growing way that public health agencies around the world are reporting autism stats. And I use it as sort of a bellwether as to what's happening and how the incidence of it is increasing. And so if we look at, this just came out about 6 weeks ago, I believe, the 2020 stats in the US, Centers for Disease Control is of course all over this in measuring it. And first of all, they define ASD as a developmental disability characterized by persistent impairments in social interaction and the presence of restricted repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities, and there's a footnote there that I don't have, that can cause a wide array of difficulties in social interaction, communication, and participation in daily activities. These are sort of, the more severe of, let's say, the injured or people that, I think when they're diagnosing it, they do treat it as an injury, and that's something I had to get my head around a while back. If there's an ASD, there is a rather serious impairment there. If their impairment is not severe enough to be ASD, you're somewhere else on this spectrum. Maybe it's just ADHD, maybe it's Tourette's syndrome, all these other things that play into it. And so these people, although they can be really bright, there is something that holds them back, and the processing just may be inhibited in some way. And so in the US in the year 2000, they estimated, using only 1 or 2 sites, I think this started in Atlanta, Georgia, they came up with 1 in 150 children had autism, period. And then by 2018, that number grew to 1 in 44, and they started to, by then really refine the way that they were measuring it. And so every 2 years, they come out with a new survey. And the latest one is using 11 US sites, which they've been using for a little while, and finding that 1 in 36 8-year-olds are diagnosed ASD. The number's a little bit higher than that when you include age 1 to 17, which we see in other public health agencies. So if I go ahead here, for example, Northern Ireland, something that was just released back last fall, their 2022 stats, which actually included 2021 and 2022, showed that 1 in 21 school-age children, that would be from about age 1 to 17, are diagnosed autistic, and it's 1 in 15 in boys, compared to in 2009, they were finding 1 in 82. Public Health Agency of Canada, these are fairly new stats to their 2019 stats, show 1 in 50 overall age 1 to 17, and 53.7% of these are diagnosed by age 5. And if you look at the difference between boys and girls in Canada, this is pretty similar to other parts of the world. 1 in 32 boys, 1 in 125 girls. So it does affect boys a little more than girls. And I know anecdotally in my studio, the majority of, not necessarily ASD, but I'd say neurodiverse kids that I work with, the majority of them are boys, for whatever reason. So that's a little bit about statistics. And again, anyone have any questions? You want links to these things? Where do I find this information? Feel free to let me know and I can provide that. So neurodiverse traits, they store memory, these kids generally, and I should say adults as well. They store memory and learn by visualizing. They're taking things in through their eyes for sure, but there's this, what I've often heard referred to as a movie screen going on in the brain, where they picture and visualize what's happening in the world around them, something they want to learn. And over time, they add to that picture, and over time, if we give them enough time, they get a crystallized vision of exactly how something works. But it's because they're visualizing in their brain. And there are some really famous people out there that have done a lot of work on this that are really interesting to listen to. Temple Grandin being probably comes to the front of my mind. If you're curious about this, check out her work on YouTube, and it's quite amazing. Someone's asking, do you have the Canadian facts? Yeah, okay, so I've just given that. Social communication may be difficult. You can pick up sometimes in a student if they have trouble gaining eye contact with you. I've often seen students that are coached around that eye contact thing. And so then they become really hyper-focused because they know there is something they're consciously working on gaining eye contact, and they kind of lock eyes with you. It's another clue that maybe there's something going on there. Difficulty learning new tasks, processing. This is around executive function in the brain and the ability of the frontal lobes to process information is generally somehow impaired in neurodiverse people, or can be impaired. They may be challenged by oral skills and have difficulty speaking. They've got the information in their mind, but they can't output it. And you see these, you know, it's most tragic in the nonverbal autistic children, where they can't communicate at all through oral means. Easily stimulated by external means like sounds, lights, smells, and I also put emotions in there. They're very keen at picking up our emotions, or when emotions get broadcast at them, it really hits them hard, or can hit them hard. They may exhibit unusual behaviors, and that is, again, they're uninhibited, and so they don't understand social norms generally the way that some people do, and so it appears to be as acting out. It may be elation, it may be joy, it also may be sadness, and it may be tragedy that they're acting out sometimes, and so that is on full display generally. Yeah, Paula, this is a great point here. You definitely lock eye contact to prove you're paying attention. Yeah, and sometimes people have told me that I do that as well. Also, many girls present ADHD and so on with dyslexia, anxiety, and less with hyperactivity. Yeah, and I've heard it's difficult to have girls. They don't get diagnosed as often because they can mask it so much easier, it seems, than boys for some reason. Yeah, and thanks for being open about this. This is really great. Difficulty adapting to new situations or changing tasks, especially those that are unpredictable. That's something that's bound to set off a neurodiverse person in certain environments, and something I'll talk a little bit about later here. Readily challenges authority. You know, if they're feeling like, you know, something's not right in their world, they will challenge the people with authority. They don't just listen to authority. They take charge of situations, which is really great, actually. They thrive on predictable outcomes and resist challenges. And I put here, they would rather sit on the sidelines than risk failure sometimes. And we'll see that in students, and I'll comment on it later. Or if I don't, make sure someone tells me. But it's basically around, you know, you see students that are perhaps neurodiverse, and we want to get something out of them. We want them to take the next step with us in the studio in a lesson, and they don't want to. Generally, that's a crisis of confidence, where they don't feel confident that they're going to succeed in that moment. They'd rather figure it out on their own than risk, failing in front of someone else. And so that's something that's really huge. We have to figure out how to overcome that in a lesson and create an environment where they're going to be okay experimenting and trying new things. That's a really difficult challenge sometimes in a studio dealing with these students. So how do we recognize neurodiverse students? Number one, for me, they prefer to lead the music lesson. Maybe not in the first lesson or two, but very quickly after. They've got an agenda when they come in. And, it took me a while to figure that out, but I give them quite a long leash and let them run with it. And sometimes where they lead the lessons, not where I want to go, but I've just, for me, it's about where they want to go. And that's hard to do. It's really hard. And it took me a long time. And there's an evolution there. And I know over the pandemic, I didn't have any beginners for 4 years. And this year I've taken on a few new beginners, and very quickly I was realizing what was going on and reminded of all of these things that I actually hadn't had to think about or use. And so I took it. I had to go with it and figure out how to let them lead again and become comfortable with it. A lot of it was just me getting comfortable with that kind of leash and let the student direct things around, and I'll figure out later how to rein it in when necessary, how to create those boundaries. They may prefer to avoid learning new music in the lessons. We get to that point in the lesson where it's time to learn a new piece of music, especially in a beginner method book, let's say, and they generally don't want to do that in front of you. They would rather do it themselves. They tend to be pretty good readers, once they understand the language, and sometimes it doesn't take them much to understand what the language is, but they can put it together on their own. So I'm trying to find ways to get them to learn the new piece with me without actually getting them to challenge reading. We just look at little patterns and things, and things that are more non-threatening, because they will generally try to avoid that or shut down. They may be resistant to correcting things. Or maybe I should just say they are resistant to correcting things generally. Depends on how, where they are on the particular spectrum. But you'll notice that where, you try to correct them like you would with other students and they don't want to, or they don't hear it, or they're hearing it, but they can't duplicate it. And they're not seemingly able to recognize that it is different than you're playing. Those are things that may indicate that we're dealing with a neurodiverse student. Difficult to make rhythmic corrections, especially. And again, it's not that they're not hearing it, but as these students, they get this visualization on their inner movie screen about how things are going. Over time, they're creating this crystallized vision of exactly how it should go. And so once they've got a rhythm in mind, it's very difficult to overwrite and create a new memory when they have to go through that visualization process. So it's very difficult because we kind of want to give them the ability to succeed by making that first visualization the most correct way, because later on it is very difficult to change it. And I find this gets better as they get older. And when they're younger, you just have to let certain things go generally. They're reluctant to take any perceived risks. Again, anything that's risky or that they're not going to succeed at, they will generally shut down. They have difficulty setting boundaries. I know everything in my studio is fair game. There are some distractions in this studio, and I just have to be prepared to let them run with it, especially when they're younger and especially earlier on as you're building a rapport and trying to, give them the feeling that this is a safe place and I'm on their side. That usually takes many weeks or sometimes a year or two. And so in the meantime, I have to block out distractions. I have other keyboards set up. I have to unplug them sometimes when certain students come in. Any personal items, sometimes I have to remove from the studio. I have to close doors to other parts of the house. Sometimes those kind of things we have to just be prepared for, because to them, anything's fair game. If it's in their environment, they need to get comfortable with it. And certain neurodiverse students, not many, but some, they do have certain, I don't want to call them fetishes, but they're curious about certain things. They're curious about sinks. They're curious about refrigerators, whatever it might be, bathrooms. I've had, a student on one side to keep the bathroom door closed. They were always curious about the bathroom. Things like that. So we have to be aware that everything in the studio is fair game for them. They may question our authority or demand reasons. And I try to get to the point very quickly where there is no authority. I'm not an authority figure. I'm just a peer with them. And so if we do need to give reasons, or I feel like they need a reason for something, I'm just prepared to explain to them a reason for something. I'm trying to think of an example so you can get what I really mean. It might look something like, well, why do I have to play these scales? Well, these scales are really wonderful patterns because they can give you a template for how, and you give them, an intellectual response. If you appeal to their intellect, they'll usually respond quite favorably. Yeah, that's the word, favorably. But that's what I mean by they demand reasons. They may not be asking for a reason, but I just always give them a reason, and I take time to explain it in quite a bit of detail so that they can follow and they can understand that they're in charge. They may get frustrated easily and have short attention spans. As soon as I see a student frustrated or starting to shut down, I'm going too fast. That's my first assumption. I'm just simply going too fast. They're trying to get this crystallized vision of the concepts and how it's all put together musically in the situation that we're in. And they need time to consolidate and incubate that. And what's difficult is that may take a few minutes, but it may take a few days. It may take a few weeks. And whatever concept I'm trying to get across, may take a couple of years. I have to be comfortable with that. And I find that if you are comfortable, they'll keep coming back. That attention span will get longer. They'll get frustrated much less. But frustration is, to me, the point where we have to back off and reappraise. Okay, what did I do that went too quickly there? They're asking for more time, basically, in my mind. Okay, chat box. Do you have any suggestions to help them practice sections of music that are not fluent? Yeah, let's talk about what that looks like. Or you know what, I'm going to come back to these because I want to give a bunch of details later on, and then we can go back and look at some of these specific things. I think these are great. Just like, why do we catch left-hand notes in Baroque music when not written? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'll come back to some of this stuff. So again, they thrive on predictable outcomes and resist challenges, and they'd rather sit on the sidelines than risk failure. That's something to really watch out for. If they need to sit on the sideline, they need a timeout, they need to reset, and you have to find something else to do. We're not going to be sitting at the piano reading music. And that's hard. It was really hard for me. It took me many years to figure out what to do in that situation. But I've got enough other things around. I've got backing tracks. I've got, well, I'll show you maybe. I've got two keyboards. I've got a digital piano. Can't really see it. digital piano next to the acoustic piano. That's for was for online teaching and then return to in-person lessons, so I don't have to touch their keyboard. And that's something I just got used to and I really like. I've got a backing keyboard over here. It's more of a drum machine for me than anything, but it's got 1,000 different sounds. It's a great roll and it's got great sounds on it. And I can use it to, let a student improvise on, try out the organ sounds, teach them how to drum on a drum kit with it, all sorts of different things. We're always adding things to the music that way. So that's a great distraction tool when we need to do something else that's musical, to reintroduce a fun way to go about what we're doing. And I mean, just them looking through the music and the sounds can really, stimulate their energy, because they need passion around what they're doing. If they don't have passion, they're not going to move forward with our agenda, which is usually reading piano music on a score, hands together. That's something they're not so interested in a lot of the time. And so if we can divert to something else that stimulates their passion for the music and helps them put the whole package together, they start to remember why they're doing this, and then they're more likely to get back to the music with you and get back on our schedule. I also have Orff instruments and xylophones that I have right in the studio here. They're just tucked away down on the floor back there. And when younger students are here, I've got them out all the time on the floor all week long. And we can hop on those in any moment when we need a timeout. I can put a backing track on and we can play along with it in some way, improvise, or find ways to rearrange those bars on the xylophones. Is a really great thing. They can make up their own scales and they can use their intellect to try things out. And so for young people, generally I'm looking at a 45-minute lesson now instead of 30 minutes. 30 minutes to start out, but pretty quickly, if I see that we need this distraction time and things are taking longer, I go to 45 minutes, and that works quite well. Then it gives us that time to do certain things. I can think of one student where when he comes in, often coming from school, he's usually happy to get out of school, but once in a while, something's going on at school that's actually interesting, and it's devastating for them to leave the classroom. So by the time they get here, they're in a bit of a state. And I just tell the parent, no, here, I can deal with this. Leave them with me and we'll work through it. Well, I've got 45 minutes. So the first 10 minutes, we can actually talk about something intelligent, socialize, get him into the piano mode later, so that later we can actually accomplish some music. And that seems to work pretty well. And the parents are on side and grateful for that. Okay, so neurodiverse traits. How do we recognize them? I've talked about, I think I went backwards there for a bit. Yeah, I did. I went backwards. Sorry. Frustrated is inability to understand others' thoughts or directions. I read something once about autistic people in general, and that was a definition where someone tried to define it by the inability for someone to conceive of other brains. I still don't fully know what that means, but sometimes I think I get a glimpse at it. I haven't seen that repeated too often, but it's something that's always stuck with me, where there are times where I have an agenda, but I get the feeling that this student doesn't realize that I have an agenda. It's because it's all about their agenda. And so that's why we kind of have to let them lead. They're totally seemingly incapable, some of them, in certain situations, maybe where they're feeling frustrated or things aren't working right for them. They're not getting their crystallized vision of how these musical concepts come together. They have their own agenda and they can't possibly focus on my agenda. And so sometimes you give a direction or you're trying to get them to copy something you're doing and it's just not sinking in at all. That's probably what's going on. They're just not able to understand that my thoughts are part of the equation. So I have to step back, treat them as an equal, and work as peers to understand something else and bring them back a step until they're comfortable. Difficult to do. And again, I don't have all the solutions. I'm just proposing things I'm noticing and things, starting places, I think. Old language, right brain, left brain, something I used to think about because it was a lot of what we had out there. And I think it's more current to speak of whole brain approaches to learning styles now. And the research is showing that. And so one thing that I stumbled across about 15 years ago, 2 books. One was called Right Brain Children in a Left Brain World, Unlocking the Potential of Your Child. Hang on, there's another word there I can't see because my camera's not. Your ADD child, which was neat. And then about 12 years later, another book published, Raising a Left Brain Child in a Right Brain World, Strategies for Helping Bright, Quirky, Socially Awkward Children to Thrive at Home, at School, and at School. And so it's kind of neat, 2 different books, both really valuable. I read them both, they were great. But looking at things in a totally different manner, where right brain and left brain, the way we used to sort of classify those things, there was a lot of overlap. And, I've seen people describe autistic people as right brain. I've seen them describe people as left brain. And I see a lot of both. And so I'm trying to get away from the right brain and left brain language and think more of whole brain approaches. And you can certainly see that in Deborah Wanless's language last week in her really great masterclass on teaching beginners. It's just she's classifying the learning style and telling us about those different learning styles. Okay, next. So strategies for working with neurodiverse students. This is some of the things I've already referenced them, but this will help stimulate some interesting discussion here, I'm hoping, and I can get to some of those questions, which are more specific. And we can create a dialogue around that. And again, if anyone wants to raise their hand at any point, let me know and I should see that. And then I can bring you on and we can chat live, because I know there are quite a number of you here today. It would be great to do that. So strategies for working with them: creating a welcoming, safe environment and prioritize rapport building. So right from the start, it's not so much about getting to the music. It's about, I want to demonstrate that I'm here with you as a peer. I'm not here as an authority figure. Yeah, okay, you're going to learn from me, but I'm going to learn from you too. And I find you interesting. And I want to know what makes you tick. I want to know how you think. I'm not going to really let you know how I think, because I don't think you're really interested in that, but you might be, and in which case I'll answer a question or two if they come up. But we're peers working on something together, some common goal. And over time, you're going to learn how to play music, supposedly, or gain whatever understanding you want out of it. That's sort of how I approach it in terms of what my priorities are. In terms of setting precedents and developing lesson patterns, I feel like I've got about 2 lessons to do that if it's a young beginner. If it's someone, I've had many come to me as transfer students that are, clearly neurodiverse, and there are already patterns in play, and you just have to kind of run with it for quite a while, and it may take a year or two to develop your own set of, guidelines again with them, because they've already got a pretty crystallized vision of how music lessons go, and it's not going to be anything you're doing. And so you have to figure out slowly how to adapt to what they've done and looking for clues into how things were done. And they'll gladly show you everything in their history and their vision of how music works. And so you start there and use that as a starting point. But new students, brand new to music, it's great because you have about 2 lessons, I feel. And by the 3rd lesson, they want to run the show. You're going to see behaviors. You're going to see things they're uncomfortable about. And that's how you know, okay, I have to treat this person differently if I haven't already, or I haven't caught on. Focus on the experience rather than getting musical results. Musical results, again, in a results-oriented world for these students, they're not so interested in results. They're interested in just having an experience. And that's how I look at it and try and get things across to them. Try to block out distractions, but allow time for the wandering and the fidgeting. I have some students come in, they're not going to sit at the piano right away. They're going to pace around the room. They have to check everything out. I've got natural light flooding in from the south and the west, which creates a good environment for them. As long as it's not dark, I don't have the overhead lights on or any fluorescent lights, anything like that, anything that's going to flicker. And they adapt pretty quickly, but yeah, they'll check out the plants. They're going to check out everything. And as I see that, I start to remove more and more from the room, so there's less to check out. But just realize in the 2nd lesson, they're going to notice what's missing. So really key to sort of anticipate that this could happen and know how to handle it, but just simply allow time for it. Let them wander and fidget. They just have to get comfortable. And there may be times in the lesson where you have to stop. And I know Marjorie Purdy, when we had her on, she talks about this too. The stretching breaks and the breaks for other things are really critical part of the lesson nowadays if you're dealing with 5, 6, 7-year-olds. No pressuring or coercing. And pointing out mistakes can enhance perfectionism. Some of these students, again, they want to get it right away. They can't stand getting something wrong in front of someone else a lot of the time. And so there can't be any pressure to get it right. And coercing them just doesn't work. If you want to see one of these kids melt down or get really frustrated really fast, try coercing them and you'll see what happens. I'm sure you all know what I mean. I'm just pointing out the things that we're looking for. And so to anticipate that and to know and to tread cautiously and figure out how to get there. I mean, it all starts with just our tone of voice, right? If we sound authoritarian, certain kids will just shut down. It's, again, you're my peer, you're not a student, and I'm not the teacher. It's a different paradigm to get into, but it's a safe place that can really work for these kids. Allow more time for processing, more time pacing, learning, incubated. It all takes so much time, maybe more time than we're used to. And so I take the long view and I say, where are we going to be a year from now? I know we're having trouble fixing this rhythm, but where are we going to be a year from now if I'm persistent in a calm way that, lovingly entraps them into what we're trying to do in a fun way, or a way that heightens their passion for something? Where are we going to be later? And so the thing I often think about is, if we're getting step-by-step instructions, okay, we're using your right hand, your thumb goes on middle C, and we're starting in the treble clef, things like this. By the time you get to step 3 or 4, they haven't understood step 1 yet. They're trying to follow everything, but they haven't fully visualized what you mean by right hand. And so they didn't hear step 2. They heard step 3, but it comes out of order. By the time you get to step 5, if you have a series of instructions, we just think that they're incapable or they're not listening to us. It's not that. It's just that they didn't get step 1, and we didn't give them time to identify right hand. It takes them a little longer than others, no matter how long they've been at it. And so that's just one little example about what I mean by processing pacing, how long it takes to incubate a concept. And these are things more, from beginners, young beginners, if they happen to be neurodiverse. It's just going to take a little bit more time to figure out things. But once they do, and once they've got step 1, 2, 3 figured out, you watch the flow start to happen. It gets quite exciting how fast they can actually move. It's just the upfront friction. It's like moving a grand piano. There's this limiting static friction, science calls it, where it takes a while to get it going, but once it's rolling, it rolls, and it really works quite well. So just work with that limiting static friction at the front to make sure they have a really accurate vision in their minds for what exactly we want to happen. Let's go to questions here. Okay, suggestions to help them practice sections of music that are not fluent. I guess the number one suggestion I have is, I try not to worry about it too much, but if they've been around for a while, I think I can play it for them, and they can try and model it back, and I can play it again, and then we move on to something else. And guaranteed that kind of thing is going to show up somewhere else. So I'm just going to keep correcting them casually. And of course, when they're done playing a piece of music, they just want to turn the page and go on to the next one. Some days I let that go. Let's just play the whole battle. You've learned 4 pieces and you've obviously practiced them. You want to play them for me. Let's go ahead and play through them all. And then we'll go back and we'll look at them later and just see what's happening. Try to be non-threatening about it. And there's certain days where that's not going to work. You're going to have to wait till next week. They came out of a bad situation at school where they were doing something fun and they got pulled out to come to their lesson. Or something else happened. Who knows? It could be any number of things. We don't know. And often they can't tell us. They can't identify what the trauma is that's going on in their minds, but they're not having a good day. That's not a good day to try and correct things. And we have to be okay with that. But I know a year from now, they're going to be much more fluent because it's just going to take them time to, again, get that vision for how things really work, get their body on side with what their mind already knows. That's the one thing. Their mind knows what it should sound like. I'm convinced. It's just that it's getting through the density of the body that is often problematic for a lot of these kids and adults. Why do we catch left-hand notes in Baroque music when not written? Detach. And you say, okay, maybe you understood what I was thinking there. Why do we catch left-hand notes in Baroque? I'm just not quite sure, Rosalind, what you mean by that. Go ahead and feel free to clarify in the chat box so I know I'm answering your question correctly there. Okay, then Heather's asking, how do you deal with parents who don't acknowledge that their child is neurodiverse and expect their child to progress at a normal rate? Yeah, that's tough. If the neurodiversity is diverse enough, I trust what the mothers are thinking, Jen. I've learned that mothers especially, and fathers too, but mothers are just absolute saints in these situations where they know intrinsically, often without being able to articulate, what the student needs or what it is. Now, but you will get these parents that aren't intuitive about what's really going on. And so they want to push and they want to see results. Yeah, that's hard. That's really tough. And so try to have the parent in the room, which they often are. It depends. Some parents don't want to be near the lesson because they do things to trigger the student to act up and get frustrated. And in those cases, I'd rather not have the parent here. But I just explain to them, we still don't have that ready. We're not ready. If we did an exam, we'd be scoring 65%, and that's, we don't want to set anyone up for failure. I think we have to take the long view here and just explain to them what it's going to be. When they don't acknowledge it, that's on them. That's not on us. And sometimes we take that on us, where we feel like we're being boxed or backed into a corner. Parent has certain expectations. We know they're not reasonable. And they're not willing to acknowledge what's really happening, that the child has, I don't want to say a disability, they just have a different way of thinking. And so I might just turn it back on that and just say, you know what, I just feel like we're on a path here that's going to get us there in a kind of roundabout way, but when we get there, it's going to be 90%. We're going to be able to do that exam, or we're going to be able to do that digital badge, and it's going to be a gold standard. And right now we're working on really refining some really basic things that are going to make a huge difference in the long run. What I try to do in that situation is get them to believe in the long run. Don't start looking for short-term success. This is not any easier, and it certainly is much harder than anything we do at school. Learning to play music, especially learning to play the piano when you've got up to 10 notes at a time. At the beginning, it's not like that, but this is a lot harder than anything these students do at school. What's happening at school, by the way? I try to find out sometimes, either through the student. Did you get your report card? How's it going? Ask the parents. Try to dig in a little bit. I think there are a lot of times, and I've been privy to this information, where teachers are trying to help families, and the adults aren't. They're not open to the help. They don't, like I said, they don't want to acknowledge what's really happening for the student, because the school may be able to help. People feel like they want to manage it on their own. Yeah, and number one, don't take it on ourselves. We can't help people that aren't, but we can coach around it and try and keep them involved, and eventually they might see something. But I think in the long run, we can help these kids win, was what my goal is. And I just don't take it personally when I see them not getting it. Okay, I get parents who sit in the room and correct them while I'm teaching, including demanding perfection when I'm trying to be more laid back. This is a problem. Yeah, that's a problem. And man, I don't have this problem anymore, but I had it many times in the past. Nowadays, I just have parents who just get it. They sit there and they're quiet because they know they trigger the student and they know they're going to trigger some kind of episode, and they want to micromanage the situation. And I'm lucky right now, those parents either leave or they just sit there and they let me deal with it. And I let quite a bit go for quite a while, but then sometimes I have to intervene. The behavior is so bad. The parent's not going to correct the behavior. And at first I wish they would. Then I realized, no, you know what? The parent, by not saying anything, is giving me the license to correct the behavior. Time to sit down with the student, the 7-year-old, and have a chat. And I've had a couple of those this year, and it works really well, because the one thing these kids want to do, they do want to please you, but they understand emotion and they want to connect on a deep emotional level. And so if you just tell them, hey, you know what, when we do this and we distract this way and we act this way, it actually, I get my feelings hurt. My feelings are hurt by this. Boom, you want to get one of these kids' attention. That's a great way to do it. They don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. That's the last thing they want. They're incredibly empathetic that way, emotionally empathetic. And so if you can appeal to that, that can really help a little bit. So in the situation Paula's talking about, though, where you've got a parent demanding perfection, yeah, I think just to be, all honesty with them, figure out how to have a chat with the parent, and just be honest with them, and don't be afraid just to lay it on the line. This is what we're trying to accomplish here. And actually, what's happening right now is that kind of comment is actually triggering them to get defensive. And you can actually, if they don't see what you're trying to do, sometimes you have to spell it out, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to be actually quite grateful for it. It'll take them time to think about it, but I'm starting to realize that this influx of parents coming into the lesson, which for me started about 20 years ago, and I wasn't used to. I was always traveling house to house at first for a long time, about 15 years. And so the parents were hovering around, but not really engaged in the lesson. And then when I started teaching out of my home studio, all of a sudden parents wanted to take more of an active role. It took me a long time to get used to, but I started to realize after a while, especially the school teachers that were sitting in, they were just trying to figure out, and other ways to relate to their kids. And they were taking clues from me and learning from me and that kind of thing. So realize that too, that they may not seem open, but try it out. See if they're open to your way of doing things, and you can spell it out for them and just say, this is what I'm trying to achieve here. It's not about the perfection. It's about this other goal later on. And I don't want the student to shut down. Even if the student's not there, have that discussion later on the phone or something. That's what I'd suggest, and have the power to do that. And if you're wrong, that's all right. Maybe they'll go somewhere else. It's unfortunate, but we don't want that to happen. But if people aren't willing to acknowledge and accept certain things, we shouldn't have to go along with it. If in our gut it doesn't feel right, go ahead and question it. And take that bold step. And certainly the student will thank you. And to me, that's who we're trying to serve here. Okay, so back to Rosalind's question about Baroque music notes. So you were giving an example of your ND students questioning things. A common for me is, why do we detach left-hand Baroque music notes when it's not on the page? Yeah, because they're so literal, right? It has to be shown. Otherwise, they don't understand things that aren't black and white or literal. I show them stylistic videos of the area to support, but they're not really bothered by it not being on the page. Why do we detach left-hand Baroque music when it's not on the page? Yeah, so I think you're doing the right thing. You give them the whole context. They want to see the whole thing. Give them stylistic videos of where they're playing in period instruments. Give them all the reasons why we do that kind of thing, and they should be happy with it, right? Just because it's not on the page. And if they're still bothered by it, say, hey, let's over edit. Let's go ahead and edit every single note. Some of them are probably quite comfortable with that. They love that kind of detail. Right? Some of them don't. As long as they've got that context that you've already given them, it sounds like they should be fine in terms of understanding, because you've given them the big picture. One thing I'll talk about later is, give them the big picture first. You can fill in the detail later. Not necessarily the best musical approach, but it's the way their brain works. And so we have to be comfortable with doing that. So I'm always playing it for them first. I've got backing tracks. I let them hear the backing track before we even try it. Not the greatest for learning to read music sometimes, but most of these kids read music pretty well anyways. They understand how to decode languages, most of them. They're not inhibited in that way so much. So I don't worry about it. And I give them so much to read in the first couple of years that, I don't even get anywhere near grade 1 for 2 or 3 years with most students. So by the time they get to read, they've read patterns to death, and grade 1's not going to be a problem reading music. Yeah, okay, so Paula, back to her. You worry the 6-year-old will hate music at the rate we're going. Yeah, then I feel like you need to intervene on behalf of the student. You can be the student activist and the advocate. The parent doesn't realize it in the moment, but they're sitting there in the lesson to learn something from you. And if they don't want to acknowledge it, that's not your problem. That sounds a bit harsh, but that's how I'd look at it nowadays anyway. I wouldn't have looked at it like that even 10 years ago, probably, but things change. Eventually people come around. If you're really firm, if someone really disagrees with you, they'll just go somewhere else, and someone else will come in the front door that'll happily be in your studio. Build confidence through positive reinforcement. This is an interesting one. And again, it's part of being a peer. It's not so much I'm proud of the way you're articulating that left hand, those left-hand quarter notes. I'm just so proud of the way you're getting those detached quarter notes happening. I don't want to be proud of them because now you may induce a pressure to succeed. Instead, I like the way you're able to articulate those left-hand notes. That takes a lot of attention and dedication. You really understand how Baroque music works. That's confidence building, I think. I think that's a really great way to go about it, rather than praising so much. It's praising, but it's not worshiping them in any strange way. Challenge them when appropriate. They can skip steps and hyperfocus when confident. The hyperfocus thing I find comes a bit later. Some of my older students this year, university age students, most of them were guys. Their ability to take music, I had three guys this year at university, never had a piano lesson in their life, were taking this as an elective. And they could play, they came in playing grade 8, 9 level pieces, memorized. They wouldn't even bring the score with them. They'd have the score. They'd decode the score reluctantly because it's the only way they could learn it well, and commit it to memory in their body so fast, because they'd start at 2 a.m. because they couldn't sleep, and they'd be up till 5 a.m. That's this ability to hyperfocus, the ADD mind, ability to hyperfocus all night, get something into the body, and now you don't need the music anymore. And now they can work on it. And after a couple of days, can play it fluently. I used to see that a little bit. Now I'm just suddenly seeing it a lot more. And so that's that ability to hyperfocus can really be an asset for them. They hate the fact that they can't read music. It drives them nuts, but I just try to point out to them, what you just accomplished, too bad it's in the middle of the night and your sleep schedule is messed up, but what you just accomplished is so much better. And you're so further ahead than the student that has to spend a month or two reading what you just did. Generally they don't want to hear it because I'm praising a little bit, but that kind of thing, just by looking at it, we challenge them when it's appropriate and learn that they can lead. If they're going to lead and this is the material they want to work on, this is how we're going to do it. That's what I mean by skipping steps. For us, that's skipping steps. It's skipping a lot of steps. And I spent a lot of time this last year pointing out to them, I have a 7-year-old and I'm taking a 7-year-old through learning to read music. They'd get to what you just did in 12 years, roughly. I don't know if they really get it or not, but just to put it in context, the steps that we're skipping here. And you're able to do that because you have this amazing ability to hyper focus. And in the middle of the night, when there are no distractions left, this is often why they're staying up late, I believe, is because now they can get a real crystallized vision on their internal movie screen of visually exactly how it should all come together. And there are no distractions to inhibit them from doing that. that there are during the day, people texting them, YouTube videos to watch, homework to do, whatever it is. Okay, next, I've got another page on strategies here. We'll see what comes. And again, keep your questions coming. Just fire them in the chat box. Method books can be a blessing because it provides structure that they thrive on. I've always thrived on method books for everyone, but especially these kids. If in those first couple lessons you establish a way of working, they understand that, I like to do every piece in order, and that structure, they know when they come in that there's something predictable going to happen. We're going to go from here to here to here to here. And if they need a way out, we can go over here and we can go over here, and that's it. They thrive on that kind of structure. And I think that's really important. That's why I use method books right from the start. I can try to give the big picture first, play it for them if it's difficult, let them hear the backing track for how it goes. I use the Hal Leonard piano method that has just amazing backing tracks that I really like. There's very little on the page to get distracted by. It's all really clean. I'm playing to their strong ears, and now they can succeed more easily when they know what that final destination is. They know how it's going to sound, and they can use the strength of their ears, and then they can use their intellect to decode the symbols on the page using the simple instructions I've given that they understand. And it takes a little while at first. I've got 4 students right now. One I'd say is neurodiverse, no, 2 are neurodiverse. The one that's I'd say most neurodiverse is by far the furthest along, because we went really slow at first. We tolerated the behaviors. Mom sits there very quietly. We bang on the ORF instruments when we need to. I've never turned on the keyboard for her. I'm afraid to do that. There's stuffed animals in the lesson. It's wonderful. But all of a sudden in the last 4 weeks, what started out as this sort of slow linear progression and a lot of confidence crises and so on, boom, now coming in every week, everything's learned quite well, can play with the backing tracks. So just a little bit of patience. And after a few months and about 20 lessons, things take off. And I attribute that to the method books and providing that structure that's predictable for them when they're young. So notice if they can form pictures in their minds, and once their inner visualization is strong and complete, their execution is more likely flawless. So one thing about these students, whether young or old, when that movie screen has a really good crystallized vision of what it is they're trying to accomplish, it's very hard to overwrite it, but when it's perfect, it can be outputted perfectly in any situation for years. It's kind of a really neat gift that they have. It's solid, it's in stone. It takes time to get it sometimes, to get it the way they want it. But once they do, it's incredibly reliable, and incredibly reliable on stage in a performance, because they're rather uninhibited by that point. When they're fully confident, they're willing to share it with anybody, generally. Not always, but for the most part. Okay, in the chat box. Okay, level 8 student on the spectrum for sure will do her first in-person exam this August. The parent has not identified a learning challenge, but is very supportive. The student has trouble with the list of instructions you described earlier for technique. How can we help work with this in the examiner to help her recognize the issues and be forgiving and patient? Yeah, you know what? I'm going to get to that in a second. That's a really good thing. And it's something we at the Conservatory Canada we've dealt with. In my next slide, I believe we'll talk about that. And that's a good point. And thanks for bringing that up. If they seem to insist on leading, let them lead, and then look for ways to guide them. Use humor along the way. Humor is really important. It brings the temperature down. There's no expectation when there's humor. Humor is fun as long as they relate to your humor, because they can be so literal if they're on the spectrum. Let's say if they're on ASD spectrum, they often don't get humor. So you have to be careful with how and whom you use it with. The younger they are, probably not as humorous. You just might have to try and find things they're humorous about and go with that as a way of guiding, so that they're leading the show. You want to correct things. This is a way that you can do this delicate balance. And it takes a bit of practice and a bit of thought. And it doesn't come overnight. I know it took me a good decade to learn how to have fun in a piano lesson. And it took a bunch of these kids to show me the way. And I just kind of, in a way, gave up and just started watching how they did things and went with it. And it was uncomfortable for a long time. But eventually it started to work. Avoid too many verbal instructions, because again, they get bogged down in verbal things. Demonstrate, use as few words as possible, be really concise. This is something I do with all students anyways, because most music isn't meant to be translated by words. It's meant to be translated through our ears. And the more words we have, it slows down other parts of the brain that aren't really listening as well. This is why I like improv so much. Improv's a great way just to open the ears. But that's what I mean by that. We can't get too verbose like I'm being this past 45 minutes or whatever it is. It just doesn't fly with these students. They're not going to pick it up. They don't do lectures. They don't listen to lectures and understand what's happening. They have to read it for themselves. They have to experience it. And the nice thing about music is we can give them that experience with their hands. If you go slow enough at first, they will likely excel later once comfortable. I've addressed that, I think, in a fair bit of detail already. And then finding novel and relevant music as they get older, because we have to be careful. They can be easily under-aroused. Sometimes if they're not, if they're going through the same old thing too much, they're going to get complacent. They're not going to be passionate. They're not going to want to practice as much. It may become a battle to practice then. That's when we could get into a bit of trouble. And so we have to be careful to find those ways to skip steps when they're ready for it. And they'll often find it. They're easily distracted. They know where to find these things online if they have access nowadays. If they bring in a piece of music that's too hard, this becomes my number one priority with them. We may not play it exactly as written, but we find some way, because what they're trying to tell me is this is what I'm interested in. In other words, this is what I need to be passionate. If I'm not passionate, and the corpus callosum in the middle of the brain that highlights all parts of the brain, gets it all working together, if that's not highlighted and working, we're not going to accomplish anything. But what they're telling me is this is what I need to be passionate. That's how I sort of interpret it. I believe those are the strategies I have so far. And then we'll get to, and anyone has any questions, let me know. Throw them in the chat box, raise your hand. Great to have someone. Okay, we've got hands. Leanne, assuming you raised your hand on purpose, because I know that happens, I'm going to allow you to talk and you can ask your question. So Leanne, if you just unmute your microphone.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my video's not on. I'm not going to try and fix it. Thank you so much, Derek, for just acknowledging some of these things. I just want to make a comment. My first degree is in occupational therapy. So I was an OT for 18 years, and then I went started teaching piano about when I turned 40. And so I bring a different perspective to the piano. And one of the things I've noticed, I love your instructions, your ideas, but I didn't see the word motor skills anywhere. Mm-hmm. And I just think you talk a lot about them processing in. I think we always have to think about the processing that goes out of the brain. So whatever they're taking in, they can't always make it happen physically.
Yeah. No, thanks for bringing that up. It's they're impaired when it comes to motor skills often, not all the time, but definitely can be.
Yeah, and it was always explained to me once. Mm-hmm. It's like when we get into a canoe, we have that automatic skill, right? Okay, I'm going to tip. I move my body this way, or I don't. A lot of these kids, even kids with LD and ADHD, don't have that automatic response. Yeah. And I think we just need to be aware of that. And there's strategies around that as well. But I was noticing that sort of piece missing.
No, that's great. And could you give us any guidance on that? What do you do? Because you've done some teaching, you said.
Yeah. So there's an organization called CanChild at McMaster University. I'm near Hamilton. Okay. They have a lot of stuff on their website just around these children. And I think one of the biggest things is helping the child figure out the actual physical movement and maybe to do that on their own. Like, oh, you need to play that B. How are you going to do that? Yeah. And they might move their whole hand. They might move their thumb. You might need to show them that they need to move their thumb, but then they get it. But sometimes if you just tell them, they can't do it. Yeah. So it's kind of involving them. And that just comes from other, motor skills that we used to teach. But I make it really, really specific to hand skills. Yeah. Yeah.
I remember a student back in September, could not execute the fourth finger on the left hand.
Oh, yes.
And I just gave them time and waited, and they went and they touched the finger with the other hand. And all of a sudden it could go because they created a brain map that triggered that left finger to know how to move.
Yes.
Things like that. That's what you're referring to?
Yes, that kind of thing.
Kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, and it just needs to be more than just a verbal cue, I think. Yeah. And if they can be involved in the problem solving, I think that really helps.
Yeah, okay. And so CanChild, can you spell how that comes out?
Yeah, it's just I think it's capital CANCHILD. the capital of C is child.
Child.
That makes sense?
That's
CA
child.
at capital, yeah.
And that's through McMaster has these resources.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. So let's take a look at that, everyone, after too, and see what you think there. But Leanne, thanks for that. Did you have anything else that you wanted to share?
That was the big thing. I just
Yeah.
want to thank you for giving us permission to get off the page and do things differently.
Yeah. Thanks for your input here. This is really great. That's a really good point about motor skills. I'm going to add that to these slides later. Okay, thanks, Leanne. And then anybody else, just raise your hand. And you can come on just like Leanne. Don't have to have a video organized or anything like that. In terms of CC exams and accommodations, someone's asked about, and specifically about technique. And this is one of the things I use as an example for people sometimes. A student, okay, we have a lot to tell them. Let's say I remember once a grade 8 exam we were doing for a child, it's someone that had a disability that was documented. They had some simple accommodations at school. And so if we say something, okay, now let's hear the arpeggio of G sharp diminished with the left hand, or triads even more so sometimes. Let's hear E major right hand solid. That's not going to work sometimes. And so what we did for this particular student at the recommendation of the piano teacher was to have the examiner write out in advance what they were going to do on a cue card, really clear language, 3 or 4 lines, depending on the description of what was going to happen. And they would tell the student what to do slowly and hold up the card so they could also visualize it and they could see the printed words. Go to the keyboard and execute. Things like that we can do. So where we have an accommodation based on testing with documentation given by the school board or health professional, at Conservatory Canada, what we'll do is we'll just simply piggyback on that information. If the parent or the studio teacher sees something that might be useful on the exam, just provide us with first of all, tell us what you would like the accommodation to be. We'll have a look at it and say, yeah, that's fair. That's something we can offer. And then we just may ask for some simple documentation to prove that this kind of work has already been tested in the student, because we don't have the ability to do that. And then we can consider that accommodation for a student on an exam. So teachers or parents can alert our office for consideration, either in the comments when they register or by sending us an email to the registrar, to Deb in the office, and then we can have that done. We do this kind of thing all the time. We really appreciate it when we get a heads up that this student is ASD diagnosed, because then we don't have to guess, especially with these online exams. Sometimes we don't pick up the clues the same way. And so right away, our examiners are trained to look for this and know what to do. And we all teach anyway, so we know what to do. But that's something that we talk about with examiners. We can give them extra time to process instructions. There's no penalty for taking time to get these directions through the brain carefully. Of course, they've rehearsed it in the studio, but when I see a student like that, I just slow it right down. Let's play the triad. We're on triads. E major with the right hand. And we'll do that broken. If it needs to be like that, we can do that. We can even go slower if we need, depending on the result that the student's giving us. But parents and teachers, especially, we prefer the teacher reaches out to us and tells us what would be successful. Examiners can present information in a variety of formats. And teacher and parent encouraged to gently assist where needed in certain places where, we have different ways of asking things. So let's say ear training. We're going to do chord tone recognition, the 1-3-5-8 test, or the do, mi, so, do test. If we tell a student that's rehearsed 1-3-5-8 and we say, okay, now we're going to do do, mi, so, do, or do you say 1-3-5-8? We get a lot of blank looks sometimes. This is where if we have an online exam and the teacher's there, they can say, we're doing 1-3-5-8 to help fill in the blank for the student that's going to freeze because they're in a pressure situation. They don't want to get something wrong. And so their output vocally is not going to be there sometimes. And we don't know what to do as examiners. And we want to stop in that moment, acknowledge that that's happened. But that's where someone, an adult in the room, can help us translate and bridge that gap so that we don't have a big misunderstanding that undermines the confidence of the student in this situation. So that's something we're open to even in in-person exams now. We can have someone there to gently assist. They're in the background. They're just there to fill in the blanks should something come up that isn't going to make sense for that student. And the examiner doesn't know how to disentangle the situation or what the student has misunderstood, because that easily sabotages an entire exam sometimes. Now the student's focused on that moment that they didn't succeed, or they perceive they didn't succeed even when it wasn't their fault. and everything else just doesn't work from there. So that's a tragedy that we try to avoid in this way. And those are the things we're sort of on the lookout for. And we're open to suggestions all the time about this kind of thing. So that's basically my presentation. I've gone a little over time. I can't believe that was an hour and 15 minutes. But thanks for your attention and holding the space with me with this conversation. It's a tricky one. And like I said, I want to bring on some other people that are more knowledgeable than myself. I just wanted to open the conversation, see what the general interest is. If you're interested in hearing more about this, can you just throw that in the chat box quickly? I would like to hear more, or yes, or just something, just give me an indication. I don't have a poll or anything set up today. And if you do, then I can go and expand on this. I've got a couple people in mind to bring on that we could learn more from, I think, and get more detail and more into the science about what the science is showing on how to deal with these situations. Okay, so some of you would like to hear more. And I think I've answered all the questions that were there. So we're going to stop for now. Thanks all of you for joining me. I hope you all have a great weekend. One focused on boys more than girls, sure. Oh, and then one on girls. Yeah, that is different. It is different for sure. I notice when I have ensembles where I do the Orff instruments, I get groups of students together once or twice a year. I split them up into boys and girls because girls just make really nice music. Boys are a little more inhibited, so we have to go about it totally differently, unfortunately. That's just the way it is. But it's something I've noticed too. Okay, thanks for the feedback, everyone. This is really encouraging. Thanks for your attention, and we'll see you next week with Deborah Wanless talking more about this, and then I'll follow up with you all in 2 weeks' time in terms of Ask Me Anything, and we can even expand on some of these questions from today. So thanks again.